The bell above the diner door didn't chime. It choked. Most mornings, Clara ignored it, pouring cheap coffee for guys who smelled like stale beer and broken marriages. But then came the kid. 6 years old, silent as a ghost, nursing a hot chocolate while the city decayed outside. Clara gave her extra marshmallows because the world took enough from everyone. She didn't know the kid's father owned half the blood on the pavement. Until the Tuesday he walked in. Clara wiped the laminate counter with a rag that had surrendered its original color sometime during the last administration. The smell of burning grease and industrial bleach was permanently baked into her uniform. It was 6:40 in the morning. Outside, the city of Boston was a wet, grey smear against the diner windows. She hated mornings. She hated the ache in her lower back, and the way the diner's fluorescent lights buzzed like a dying wasp. Mostly, she hated the regulars. They were ghosts of men, nursing $1.50 coffees to delay whatever miserable reality awaited them outside. Then there was Booth 4. The girl had started showing up 3 weeks ago. Always at 7:15, always escorted by a man who looked like he chewed gravel for breakfast, a wide-shouldered bulldog of a guy named Sal who wore suits that fit too tight across the back. Sal would drop the kid off, order her a milk, and stand by the door, staring at the street with dead, flat eyes. He never sat. He never spoke. The kid was different. She was small, maybe 6 or 7, with dark hair braided so tightly it looked painful. She wore a pristine Catholic school uniform that cost more than Clara's car, and she never made a sound. On the 3rd day, Clara had stopped bringing milk and started bringing hot chocolate. She remembered the first time she set the heavy porcelain mug down. The girl had looked at it, then up at Clara. Her eyes were dark, calculating, too old for a face that still held baby fat. "Don't tell your babysitter," Clara had muttered, sliding 2 extra foil-wrapped butter pats onto the table, just to watch the kid's confusion. Milk builds bones. Chocolate builds character. The girl hadn't smiled, but she had wrapped her small fingers around the mug. It became a routine, a silent, unspoken treaty in the middle of the morning rush. Sal stood guard by the door, radiating menace. Clara worked the counter, pouring sludge into chipped mugs. And the girl sat in booth 4, drawing in a thick leather sketchbook. Clara never asked questions. In this neighborhood, curiosity wasn't just a flaw, it was a liability. You didn't ask why a rich kid was being babysat by a mob enforcer in a greasy spoon off the interstate. You just filled the coffee pots and minded your own business. But she watched. She noticed that the girl's drawings were incredibly detailed, not stick figures or clumsy houses with sunshine in the corner. She drew the diner. She drew the salt shakers. She drew the exhausted expressions of the truckers sitting at the counter. One Tuesday, it was pouring, the kind of torrential, bone-chilling rain that made the city look like it was melting. Sal brought the girl in, shaking the water from his umbrella, his face set in a permanent scowl. He was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow. Clara didn't blink. She grabbed a clean towel from the back, soaked it in warm water, and tossed it to him as she walked past. Sal caught it, surprised, but grunted an acknowledgement and pressed it to his head. Clara walked over to booth 4. The girl was already unpacking her sketchbook. "Nasty out there," Clara said. The girl looked up. She nodded once. Clara set down the hot chocolate. Today she added a mountain of whipped cream and 3 maraschino cherries. "Your driver looks like he caught a bad pitch." The girl glanced at Sal, then back to Clara. She picked up a crayon, charcoal grey. She began to sketch. Clara leaned over, resting her forearms on the sticky table. She was tired. She had worked a double the night before. Her feet felt like they were packed in crushed glass. But looking at this quiet, strange child anchored her. It was a sliver of humanity in a building full of dead ends. "You got a name, kid?" Clara asked. The crayon stopped moving. The girl looked at her, really looked at her. "Lily," she said. Her voice was tiny, a whisper of sound over the clatter of silverware. "Clara?" Lily nodded. She went back to her drawing. Clara went back to the grill. For a month, that was it. The routine, the hot chocolate, the silent companionship. Clara started leaving a plate of bacon on the table. Lily started leaving a quarter as a tip. It was absurd, but it was theirs. Until the morning Sal didn't show up. It was a Thursday, 7:30. The rain had returned, drumming a relentless, aggressive beat against the glass. Clara was scrubbing the grill with a pumice stone, sweat beading at her hairline. The diner was packed. Shift workers coming off the line. Cab drivers seeking shelter. The usual assortment of insomniacs. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, frying eggs, and stale tobacco. She glanced at the clock. 7:35. Booth 4 was empty. A tiny knot formed in Clara's chest. She ignored it. It wasn't her kid. It wasn't her problem. People's schedules changed. Rich kids had fancy lives. She dug the pumice stone into a stubborn patch of burnt grease. 7:40. The heavy diner door opened. The bell above it didn't just chime. It gave a choked, metallic gasp. The shift in the room was immediate. It was physical. The clatter of forks dropped. The low hum of conversation snapped shut like a book. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop 10 millibars in a second. Clara stopped scrubbing. She looked up. 4 men had stepped inside. They were massive. Not just tall, but wide, blocking out the grey morning light. They wore dark, heavy overcoats that looked expensive and entirely out of place in a diner where the meatloaf was $3. They moved with a terrifying economy of motion. 2 stepped to the left, scanning the room. 1 stepped to the right, sliding a hand into his pocket. The 4th man locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. "Hey!" Clara barked, dropping the pumice stone. "You can't do that. I've got paying." She stopped. A 5th man walked in through the heavy glass door just as the 4th man locked it. He wasn't as broad as the others. He didn't need to be. He wore a charcoal suit perfectly tailored to his frame. His tie was loosened, his top button undone. He had dark hair, slicked back by the rain, and eyes that were the exact color of a frozen lake. He didn't swagger. He didn't puff out his chest. He just stood there, and the entire room deferred to his gravity. Beside him, holding his left hand, was Lily. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Her heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't an idiot. She knew who this man was, even if she didn't know his name. You didn't grow up in the South Side without learning how to recognize a predator. The men in the coats were muscle. This man was the brain, the boss, the owner of the blood on the streets. And Lily was his daughter. One of the men, a guy with a scar running from his ear to his collarbone, stepped forward and grabbed the collar of a trucker sitting at the nearest stool. "Out," the scarred man said. "The sign says open," the trucker stammered. "Sign says closed now," the man replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Within 90 seconds, the diner was empty. The regulars, the shift workers, the cabbies, they all scrambled out the back exit into the alley, leaving half-eaten eggs and steaming coffees behind. They left money on the tables, terrified to be perceived as stealing. Only Clara remained. She stood behind the counter, a wet rag in her hands. The 4 bodyguards took up positions, 2 at the back door, 2 at the front. The man in the charcoal suit looked around. He took in the peeling linoleum, the fluorescent lights, the grease traps. His expression didn't change. It was a mask of cold, professional detachment. Then he looked down at Lily. "Which booth?" he asked. His voice was a low, resonant baritone. It didn't belong in a diner. It belonged in a boardroom or a crypt. Lily pointed a small finger at booth 4. The man walked toward it. He slid into the cracked vinyl seat. He looked entirely ridiculous, $1 million suit sinking into cheap, taped-up upholstery. But nobody was laughing. He looked at Clara. "You," he said. Clara tossed the dirty rag into the sink. She wiped her hands on her apron again. Her knees felt a little weak, but she locked them. She walked out from behind the counter, her worn sneakers squeaking against the wet floor. She stopped 3 feet from the booth. "I'm not serving you if you're going to scare off my entire morning rush," Clara said. The bodyguard nearest the door flinched, his hand moving toward his jacket. The man in the booth held up a single finger. The bodyguard froze. The man looked at Clara. He really looked at her. He took in the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed edges of her collar, the defiant set of her jaw. "You're Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. And you owe me for about 30 breakfasts." A muscle twitched in the man's jaw. It might have been amusement. It might have been annoyance. "My name is Dominic," he said. "I am Lily's father." "Figured," Clara said. "She's got your terrifying lack of expression." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He wore a Patek Philippe watch that could probably pay Clara's rent for the next decade. "For the past month," Dominic said, his voice slow, deliberate. "My daughter has refused to eat breakfast at home. She insists on coming here. With Sal, a man who is currently in the hospital with a fractured skull because he failed to notice a car tailing them yesterday." Clara glanced at Lily. The girl was looking down at her shoes. "She safe?" Clara asked, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. Dominic paused. The question seemed to throw him off balance, just for a fraction of a second. "She is unharmed," he said tightly. "Good." Clara crossed her arms. "So what do you want? If you're here to complain about the nutritional value of my hot chocolate, you can take it up with management. He comes in at noon." "I am not here to complain," Dominic said. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The room grew very still. Clara didn't breathe. Dominic pulled out a thick envelope. It was crisp, white, and heavy. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a dull thud next to the napkin dispenser. "There is $10,000 in that envelope," Dominic said. Clara looked at the envelope. She looked back at him. "Why?" "My daughter does not speak to strangers," Dominic said. "She does not speak to her nannies. She barely speaks to me. Yesterday, after the incident, she was distressed. The only thing she asked for was to see you." Clara swallowed hard. She looked at Lily again. The kid was holding the edge of Dominic's suit jacket, her knuckles white. "I don't babysit," Clara said, her voice rough. "I don't need a babysitter. I have a staff of 30 for that," Dominic said. He tapped the envelope with one manicured finger. "I am paying you for your kindness. The extra marshmallows, the bacon, the fact that you treated her like a human being in a place like this." Clara stared at the money. $10,000. It was a fortune. It was a new apartment away from the damp mold of her current basement. It was a car that didn't stall at red lights. It was breathing room. She reached out. Dominic watched her, a cynical certainty settling in his eyes. He knew this part. He knew what money did to people. He knew it bought compliance, gratitude, subservience. Clara grabbed the envelope. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the bills. Then she tossed it back across the table. It hit Dominic's coffee cup, rattling the saucer. "I don't want your blood money," Clara said. The silence in the diner was absolute. The rain against the window sounded like machine gun fire. The bodyguard by the door took a heavy step forward. "Hey, watch your mouth, sweetheart." "Leo!" Dominic snapped. The voice was quiet, but it cracked like a whip. The bodyguard stepped back, lowering his head. Dominic looked at the envelope, then slowly raised his eyes to Clara. The cynical certainty was gone. In its place was something sharp, something calculating. "It is not blood money," Dominic said. "It is a transaction." "I don't charge for basic human decency," Clara shot back. "I charged you for the hot chocolate. It's $2 a cup, plus tax. You owe me about $40. If you want to leave a tip, keep it under 20. Anything more messes up my drawer." Dominic stared at her. He was accustomed to fear. He was accustomed to greed. He was not accustomed to a tired waitress in a greasy apron treating him like a difficult customer holding up the line. He leaned back in the vinyl booth. It groaned under his weight. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked quietly. "I know exactly what you are," Clara said. "You're the guy who sends his 6-year-old to a diner with a thug because he's too busy running the city to eat breakfast with her himself." The atmosphere in the room crystallized. Clara felt the immediate, terrifying realization of what she had just said. Her mouth had always been a step ahead of her survival instincts. She braced herself, waiting for the order, waiting for one of the massive men by the door to drag her into the alley. Dominic didn't move. He didn't shout. He looked at Lily. The little girl was staring at Clara, her dark eyes wide. Dominic let out a breath. It sounded like a tired sigh. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out a slim, silver money clip. He peeled off a $50 bill and laid it carefully on the table next to the rejected envelope. "For the hot chocolate," he said. Clara picked up the 50. "I don't have change." "Keep it. I don't take charity. Put it in the tip jar, Clara, Dominic said, his tone shifting into something heavier. A command. Clara glared at him, then walked behind the counter and shoved the 50 into the plastic jar next to the register. She grabbed her order pad and walked back out. Since you chased away my entire morning rush, she said, pulling a pen from behind her ear. You're ordering. What do you want? Dominic looked at her, entirely bewildered. I don't eat diner food. You do today, Clara said. You're taking up my best booth. Order something or get out. One of the bodyguards let out a choked sound, quickly turning it into a cough. Dominic looked at the menu tucked behind the napkin dispenser. He didn't touch it. Black coffee, for me and my men. Food, Clara insisted. You look like you need a meal that didn't come with a wine pairing. And the kid needs to eat. Dominic sighed. Bring whatever you want. 2 specials, Clara said, writing it down. Eggs over easy, hash browns burnt, rye toast, extra bacon for the kid. She turned and walked back to the grill. She felt the heavy gaze of 5 men on her back. Her hands were shaking slightly as she cracked the eggs onto the flat top, the hiss of the grease loud in the quiet room. She focused on the rhythm of the work. Flip the bacon, press the hash browns, pour the coffee. It was grounding, it was real. She loaded 2 plates onto her arm, grabbed a pot of coffee and 3 mugs, and walked back to booth 4. She set the mugs down, poured the coffee black for Dominic, and slid a mug toward the end of the table for the nearest bodyguard. She set the plates down. Lily picked up a piece of bacon immediately. Dominic stared at his plate. He looked at the runny eggs and the crispy, grease-soaked potatoes as if it were an alien artifact. He picked up his fork. He took a bite. Clara stood there, waiting. He chewed slowly, swallowed. He looked up at her. It's terrible, he said. It's $3, Clara replied. You want a Michelin star, go downtown. A tiny sound broke the tension. It was a laugh. Clara looked down. Lily was giggling. She had a hand over her mouth, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It was the first time Clara had ever heard her make a sound. Dominic froze. He looked at his daughter, his hand gripping the fork, so hard his knuckles turned white. The cold, dead expression on his face shattered. For a split second, Clara didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw a father, terrified and utterly broken by the sound of his own child's laughter. He looked back at Clara. The hostility was gone. Sit, Dominic said softly. It wasn't a command this time. It was a request. Clara hesitated. She looked at the empty diner, the bodyguards standing like statues, the rain lashing against the glass. She was exhausted. Her feet ached. She pulled up a metal chair from the adjacent table and sat down across from him. Your men look thirsty, Clara said. They can wait, Dominic said. He took a sip of the bitter coffee. Sal told me about you. He said you talk to her like an adult. Kids know when you're faking it, Clara said. People in my world, they don't treat her like a child. They treat her like a target or a liability. Dominic's voice dropped, meant only for the booth. Her mother was killed 3 years ago. Since then, Lily hasn't spoken much. She observes. Clara looked at the little girl, who was now meticulously separating her hash browns from her eggs. She's a smart kid. She is. Dominic set the coffee down. Which is why I am in a difficult position, Clara. I'm a waitress. I pour coffee. I don't see how that puts you in a position. Dominic leaned forward. The air between them suddenly felt highly charged. Because whoever hit Sal yesterday knows her routine. They know she comes here. This diner is no longer safe. Clara felt a cold drop in her stomach. You're saying they might come here, to my diner. I'm saying they are looking for leverage against me. Lily is that leverage. By extension, anyone who shows her kindness is a potential vulnerability. So what? Clara asked, her voice tight. You came here to warn me? I came here, Dominic said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. To give you $10,000 so you could pack a bag, leave the city, and disappear until I handle this. Clara stared at him. You want me to run away? I want you to stay alive. Clara stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. I'm not running. This diner is the only thing keeping a roof over my head. I have rent. I have a life. You don't get to walk in here, drop a pile of cash, and tell me to abandon my life because your enemies can't aim. Dominic stood up as well. He towered over her. The bodyguards tensed. It is not a negotiation. Dominic said, his voice dropping into a deadly register. It's my life, Clara fired back, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. You might own the streets, Dominic, but you don't own me. You don't tell me where to go. They stood inches apart. The diner was dead silent. The smell of burnt coffee and ozone hung heavy in the air. Clara could see the gold flecks in his cold eyes. She could smell his cologne, something sharp and expensive, masking the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder. He didn't blink. She didn't back down. Then, a small hand tugged on Clara's apron. Clara looked down. Lily had slipped out of the booth. She was holding her leather sketchbook. She held it up to Clara. Clara took it carefully. She opened to the marked page. It wasn't a drawing of the diner. It wasn't a drawing of the truckers. It was a drawing of Clara. It was highly detailed, capturing the exact tired slant of her shoulders, the messy bun on top of her head, the way she held the coffee pot. But she wasn't standing in the diner. She was standing in front of a massive dark house, holding Lily's hand, and standing behind them, a shadowy, protective figure. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at Lily. Please, Lily whispered. Clara looked back at Dominic. The absolute certainty in his eyes had returned, but it wasn't cynical anymore. It was resolute. She doesn't want you to leave the city, Dominic said quietly, and I cannot leave her unprotected, which means I cannot leave you unprotected. What are you saying? Clara asked, a sense of inevitability settling over her. Dominic buttoned his suit jacket. I am saying, Clara, that your shift is over. You're coming with us. Clara didn't argue. She knew the difference between a choice and an ultimatum. But she also knew she wasn't leaving her life unattended. If I'm coming with you, Clara said, her voice remarkably steady for a woman whose knees were shaking, I need 5 minutes. Leo, the bodyguard by the door, scoffed. You don't get 5 minutes. We're moving. Let her, Dominic said. Clara turned her back on the men and walked to the grill. She didn't rush. Rushing showed fear. She twisted the heavy gas valves, listening to the familiar hiss-pop of the flames dying out. She grabbed the metal scraper and pushed the remaining grease into the catch tray. She turned off the coffee machines, unplugged the toaster, and walked to the register. She punched in the code, popped the drawer, and shoved the damp, crinkled bills into a canvas deposit bag. It was pathetic, really. $140. This was the sum total of her morning. She locked the register. She untied her apron, folding it neatly and leaving it on the counter next to Dominic's untouched $50 bill. Let's go, she said. The ride was a masterclass in silence. Dominic's vehicle was an extended black SUV that felt less like a car and more like a bank vault on wheels. The doors shut with a heavy, pressurized thud that blocked out the rain and the sirens and the city. The interior smelled of rich leather, peppermint, and the faint, unmistakable acridity of gun oil. Clara sat in the back. Lily sat beside her, her small hand firmly gripping the fabric of Clara's cheap, mustard yellow uniform shirt. Dominic sat in the middle row facing them, flanked by Leo. Nobody spoke. Dominic was working a burner phone. He didn't yell. He didn't make grand cinematic threats. He spoke in low, clipped sentences. Reroute the shipments. Empty the warehouse on 4th. Burn the ledgers. Find out who sold the route. I want a name by midnight. He hung up, snapped the phone in half, and dropped the plastic pieces into a cup holder. He pulled another phone from his coat pocket. Clara looked out the tinted window. They were leaving the south side, climbing toward the affluent suburbs where the houses had gates instead of chain-link fences, and the trees were actually green. She felt a profound sense of dislocation. Her worn sneakers rested on plush floor mats. She smelled like old bacon and industrial soap, sitting in a vehicle that cost more than she would earn in 3 lifetimes. Lily's head drooped. The adrenaline of the morning had worn off. She leaned against Clara's arm, her breathing evening out into the soft, rhythmic puffs of sleep. Clara stiffened at the contact, unsure of what to do. She looked at Dominic. He was watching them. The burner phone was in his hand, forgotten. His face was unreadable, a sculpted mask of shadow and hard lines. But his eyes were entirely focused on the way his daughter was using a stranger as a pillow. She hasn't slept through the night in a month, Dominic said quietly. She's exhausted, Clara replied. You people live like you're in a war zone. We are, and you drag a 6-year-old through it. Leo shifted angrily in his seat. Dominic raised a hand. I protect what is mine, Dominic said. By any means necessary. You are here because she wants you here. Do not mistake her attachment for my tolerance. If you do anything to compromise this family, the people who hit Sal will be the least of your concerns. Clara met his gaze. It was a terrifying look. Cold, absolute void of any moral hesitation. I pour coffee, Dominic. I don't plant bombs. Clara adjusted her arm so Lily could rest more comfortably. But if you think threatening me makes you look tough, you're wasting your breath. I've been threatened by meth heads with broken bottles. You're just a guy in a nicer suit. Leo actually choked. Dominic didn't blink. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. It was barely there. A microscopic break in the ice. We're here, he said, turning his attention to the window. The estate was a fortress masquerading as a modern architectural marvel. Heavy iron gates swung open smoothly. The perimeter was lined with high walls and discreetly mounted cameras. The driveway was a long sweep of crushed gravel leading to a massive structure of glass, steel, and dark stone. Men in dark clothing were stationed at regular intervals. They weren't gardeners. The SUV parked. The doors opened. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling of wet pine. Clara carefully woke Lily. The girl rubbed her eyes, grabbed her sketchbook, and immediately reached for Clara's hand. A woman was waiting in the expansive minimalist foyer. She was in her 50s, wearing a sharp grey dress, her hair pulled back into an immaculate twist. Mrs. Gable, Dominic said, shrugging off his wet coat. A man appeared instantly to take it. This is Clara. She will be staying with us indefinitely. Prepare the east guest room. Mrs. Gable's eyes flicked to Clara. She took in the stained clothes, the messy bun, the defiant posture. She didn't judge. She just nodded. Yes, sir. And Miss Lily. She will eat in her room today, Dominic said. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Gable will provide you with anything you need. Do not leave the house. Do not use your cell phone. We will talk later. He turned and walked down a long hallway, Leo trailing a step behind. Clara stood in the echoing foyer. It was cold. There were no family photos, no clutter. It felt like a very expensive mausoleum. Lily tugged on Clara's hand. Come on, kid, Clara sighed, letting the girl lead the way up the sweeping glass staircase. Let's see the cage. Clara woke up at 5:30 the next morning. Her internal clock was a tyrant, indifferent to the fact that she was currently lying on a mattress that felt like a cloud woven from silk. She stared at the ceiling. The guest room was roughly the size of her entire apartment. It had a balcony, a fireplace, and a bathroom entirely clad in black marble. On the dresser sat a stack of clothes Mrs. Gable had provided. Expensive, understated knitwear and heavy cotton trousers. None of it felt like her. She threw off the covers. She put on a pair of the provided sweatpants and a simple white t-shirt. She padded barefoot out of the room. The house was completely silent. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning. It was the tense, holding breath silence of a bunker. Security cameras tracked her movement down the hallway. She found the kitchen on the ground floor. It was absurd. 6 burners, 2 massive ovens, a walk-in refrigerator, and an island the size of a landing strip. Everything was stainless steel and polished granite. Clara opened a few cabinets until she found a bag of coffee beans. Not the cheap, pre-ground sludge she was used to, but something dark and oily that smelled like chocolate and smoke. She found a heavy cast-iron skillet. She found eggs, bacon, butter. She needed to do something with her hands. She needed the rhythm. By 6:15, the sterile kitchen smelled like a diner. The bacon was crackling, the eggs were frying, and the coffee was brewing. Clara leaned against the counter, closing her eyes, letting the familiar scents ground her in an entirely unfamiliar world. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor. Clara opened her eyes. Dominic stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark slacks and a tight black t-shirt that revealed the heavy cord of muscles in his arms, and the edge of a dark, intricate tattoo crawling up his left bicep. He looked exhausted. The bruising under his eyes was severe. He stared at the stove. He stared at Clara. The kitchen staff arrives at 7, he said. His voice was gravelly with sleep. I'm not a guest, Dominic. I don't do well sitting in a room waiting for permission to exist, Clara said. She flipped the bacon with a pair of silver tongs. I make breakfast. It's what I do. You want some, or are you going to stand there looking like you're planning a murder? Dominic crossed the room. He didn't sit at the formal dining table. He pulled out a stool at the island and sat down, resting his elbows on the cool granite. Coffee, he said. Clara poured a mug and slid it across the island. He caught it. No poison, she muttered. Yet, he took a drink. He grimaced slightly. You somehow managed to ruin $100 bag of espresso beans. I have a gift, Clara said. She plated the eggs and bacon and set it in front of him. She made a smaller plate, covered it with foil, and set it aside for Lily. Dominic picked up a fork. He ate in silence for a few minutes. The tension in his shoulders slowly began to uncoil. The kitchen felt different with the smell of grease in the air. It felt lived in. Did you get your name? Clara asked quietly. She leaned against the counter opposite him, holding her own mug. Dominic paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at her. Most people in his world didn't ask questions. They waited to be told what they needed to know. Yes, he said. And the problem is being handled. The cold finality in his tone sent a chill down her spine. Handled. She knew what that word meant in his vocabulary. It meant blood on the pavement. It meant some mother waking up without a son. Why did you bring me here? Clara asked. The truth. Not that tough guy speech about protecting what's yours. Dominic set the fork down. He pushed the plate away. He looked out the massive window at the dark, rolling grounds of the estate. The sky was just beginning to turn a bruised purple. Lily's mother, Dominic started, his voice flat, stripped of emotion. Her name was Sophia. She hated this life. She hated the house. She wanted to take Lily to the coast, live normally. He traced the rim of the coffee mug. 3 years ago, I had a meeting. Sophia decided to take Lily to a park downtown. She took my secondary car. It was a mistake in the motor pool scheduling. Dominic looked back at Clara. His eyes were hollow. The bomb was meant for me. It was wired to the ignition. Sophia died instantly. Lily was in the back seat. The reinforced steel saved her life, but she was trapped in the wreckage with her mother for 2 hours before my men could extract her. Clara stopped breathing. She set her mug down on the counter. She couldn't speak. Since that day, Lily has not spoken a full sentence to me, Dominic said. She draws. She watches. She exists like a ghost in this house. The doctors said it was trauma-induced selective mutism. They said she needed time. Dominic stood up. He walked around the island, stopping just a few feet from Clara. The physical proximity was overwhelming. He radiated a dangerous, heavy heat. Then she started demanding to go to that filthy diner on the interstate, Dominic said softly. She started eating. And yesterday she laughed. Because of you. He reached out. For a brief, terrifying second, Clara thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his hand dropped, his fingers brushing the fabric of the clean white shirt Mrs. Gable had given her. I brought you here because you are the only thread holding my daughter to the real world, Dominic said. And I will not let anything cut that thread. You will stay here. You will be compensated, but you will not leave until it is safe. He turned and walked toward the door. Dominic, Clara called out. He stopped. I'm making meatloaf tonight, she said, her voice tight but unwavering. Don't be late. Dominic didn't turn around, but he nodded once. Then he was gone. The illusion of safety lasted exactly 4 days. Clara fell into a rhythm. It was a bizarre, upside-down version of her old life. She woke up early. She cooked. Lily sat at the counter, sketching. Dominic was a ghost during the day, locked in his study with a rotating cast of serious men in dark suits. But at night, he came down to the kitchen. He ate the terrible food Clara insisted on cooking. He drank the burnt coffee. They didn't talk about the war happening outside the gates. They talked about mundane things. Clara talked about the broken radiator in her apartment. Dominic listened with a terrifying level of focus, as if her housing complaints were critical intelligence. It was Thursday night, 8:30. Rain was battering the massive glass windows of the estate, a heavy, violent downpour that obscured the cameras and turned the grounds into a swamp. Clara was in the library. It was a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling shelves that looked like they had never been touched. Lily was sitting on the thick Persian rug, coloring. Clara was reading a battered paperback she had brought with her. A sharp, unnatural sound cracked through the heavy walls of the house. Clara jumped. It wasn't thunder. It was dry, metallic. Crack, crack. Lily froze. The crayon snapped in her fist. Before Clara could move, the heavy oak doors of the library flew open. Leo burst in. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. He held a matte black submachine gun across his chest. "Move!" Leo barked. "Now!" "What's happening?" Clara scrambled off the couch, grabbing Lily's arm and hauling the girl up. "Perimeter breach, north wall, move!" The house alarms hadn't triggered. That meant whoever was outside had cut the system. Leo grabbed Clara's shoulder and shoved her toward a hidden panel behind a row of encyclopedias. He slammed his palm against a scanner. The bookshelf hissed and slid open, revealing a heavy steel door. "Get in!" Leo ordered, punching a code into the keypad. The steel door swung open. It was a panic room. Concrete walls, emergency lighting, monitors. "Where's Dominic?" Clara demanded, refusing to step inside. Handling it. "Get in the box, Clara." Gunfire erupted. It wasn't muffled this time. It was inside the house. The shattering of glass echoed down the hallway, followed by the heavy booming retort of a shotgun. Lily began to shake violently. Clara scooped the little girl up, burying Lily's face in her neck, and lunged into the small room. Leo slammed the heavy steel door shut behind them. The lock engaged with a loud, final clank, then silence. The panic room was soundproof. It was small, lit by a harsh red emergency bulb. There were 2 cots, a case of water, and a bank of security monitors on the wall. Clara set Lily down on a cot. The girl's eyes were wide, vacant, staring at nothing. She was hyperventilating, the trauma of the past clawing its way back to the surface. Hey, look at me," Clara said, dropping to her knees. She grabbed Lily's hands. They were freezing. "Lily, look at me." Lily wouldn't focus. Clara didn't know what to do. She wasn't a therapist. She was a waitress. She fell back on the only thing she knew, the routine. "All right," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay even, conversational. "Tomorrow morning, we're making pancakes. I found the good flour in the back pantry. But I'm warning you, I burn the first batch. It's a rule. You're going to have to eat the burnt ones." Lily blinked. Her breathing hitched. "And I'm making your dad eat the really burnt ones. The ones that look like hockey pucks. Because he complained about my coffee again." Clara kept talking, maintaining eye contact, anchoring the girl with the mundane reality of breakfast. "We'll drown them in syrup. It'll be fine." Slowly, the frantic rising and falling of Lily's chest began to slow. She looked at Clara. She reached out and gripped Clara's t-shirt, burying her face in Clara's shoulder. Clara held her, rocking her gently. She looked up at the security monitors. 4 of the cameras were dead, displaying only static. The others showed a nightmare. Men in tactical gear moving through the beautiful, sterile hallways of the estate. Bodies on the floor. On the feed for the main foyer, she saw Dominic. He was trapped behind a heavy marble pillar. He had a handgun. 2 men were advancing on his position, laying down heavy suppressive fire that was chipping away at the stone. Clara watched, helpless, her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her hand against the cold steel of the door. "Don't die," she thought violently. "Don't you dare leave this kid alone." On the screen, Dominic moved. He didn't retreat. He stepped out from behind the cover. The movement was a blur of calculated violence. 2 shots. The men advancing on him dropped. More static filled the screens as cameras were shot out. Clara sat on the floor of the panic room holding the quiet girl for 45 minutes. It felt like a decade. Finally, the heavy lock on the steel door clicked. Clara shoved Lily behind her, backing up against the far wall, her hands balled into fists. If it was one of the men in tactical gear, she was going to go for the eyes. The door swung open. Dominic stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. His black t-shirt was torn at the shoulder. He was covered in dust and plaster. There was blood on his face, but it wasn't his. His eyes swept the small room. He saw Clara standing defensively in front of his daughter. He saw the fierce, terrified, protective look on the waitress's face. He dropped his gun. It clattered loudly on the concrete floor. He stepped into the room. He didn't say a word. He bypassed Clara entirely and dropped to his knees in front of the cot. He pulled Lily into his arms, burying his face in his daughter's dark hair. His broad shoulders shook once. Just once. Clara stood against the wall, her adrenaline crashing. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor. Dominic pulled back. He checked Lily for injuries, his hands moving over her arms, her face. Lily was perfectly calm now. She reached up and touched the dust on her father's cheek. Dominic closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. Then he looked at Clara. He noticed it before she did. A sharp intake of breath hissed through his teeth. "Clara," he said, his voice raw. Clara looked down. Her white t-shirt was stained with a spreading patch of crimson just below her ribs. "Oh," Clara said, touching the wet fabric. Her fingers came away red. She hadn't felt the ricochet when the library doors were blown open. She hadn't felt anything over the terror of getting Lily into the room. The world suddenly tilted sideways. The red emergency lights smeared into a blurry streak. Dominic was beside her in a second. His hands, still stained with the violence outside, pressed hard against her side. "Stay awake," he commanded. The Mafia boss was gone. The cold tactician was gone. It was just a man, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "Don't close your eyes, Clara. Look at me." "I burned the pancakes," Clara slurred, her head falling back against the concrete wall. "Tell Lily. I burned the first batch." "You can burn whatever you want," Dominic said, his voice tight with an emotion Clara had never heard from him. Panic. "Just stay here. Stay with us." Clara looked at his frozen, terrified eyes as the darkness finally pulled her under. The first thing Clara registered was the smell. It wasn't the comforting scent of stale grease and burnt coffee, nor was it the sterile, expensive emptiness of the estate's guest room. It was harsh. Bleach, iodine, and rubbing alcohol. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids felt like they were lined with sandpaper. A dull, throbbing ache radiated from her right side, pulsing in time with the steady, mechanical beep of a heart monitor. When she finally managed to pry her eyes open, the light was blindingly white. She blinked rapidly, the room slowly coming into focus. It was a medical bay, but it didn't look like a hospital. There were no windows, just thick concrete walls painted a calming, deceptive eggshell blue. A shadow shifted in the corner. Dominic leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked terrible. The tailored suits and the calculated aura of invincibility were gone. He wore a rumpled grey Henley shirt that clung to his broad chest. His jaw was dark with a heavy stubble, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the gunfire stopped. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a gravelly whisper. Clara tried to speak, but her throat was desert dry. She swallowed, wincing as the movement pulled at the muscles in her side. "Water." Dominic was out of the chair instantly. He poured a plastic cup from a pitcher on the bedside table, sliding a straw past her cracked lips. He supported the back of her head with one large, calloused hand. His touch was incredibly gentle, a jarring contrast to the violence she had seen him commit. She drank, coughing weakly when she pulled away. "How long?" "2 days," Dominic said, setting the cup down. He didn't move his hand from the pillow near her head, his fingers hovering just inches from her hair. "The bullet fractured a rib and tore through muscle. The surgeon said you were lucky. An inch to the left, and it would have hit your liver." "Surgeon?" Clara croaked. "We're not in a hospital." "No. Hospitals have records. Hospitals have police." Dominic withdrew his hand, the physical distance between them immediately bringing the cold air back to her skin. "I have a surgical suite in the sub-basement. You received the best care money can buy." Clara let her head fall back against the pillow. She stared at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. The memory of the breach came rushing back. The metallic crack of the shotgun, the frantic sprint to the panic room, the heavy weight of Lily in her arms. "Lily!" Clara said, panic suddenly spiking her heart rate. The monitor beside her bed began to chime faster. "Where is she? Is she—" "She is entirely unharmed," Dominic interrupted, his voice firm, grounding her. "She is upstairs, as with Mrs. Gable. She hasn't left the house. She hasn't spoken, but she has been drawing. Non-stop." Clara let out a long breath. The monitor slowed. "The men who broke in?" Dominic's expression hardened. The vulnerable, exhausted man vanished, replaced by the apex predator she had met in the diner. The shift was seamless and terrifying. "They are no longer a concern." The absolute finality in those 6 words told Clara everything she needed to know. The men were dead. The people who sent them were likely dead, too. "You're a terrifying man, Dominic," Clara said quietly. "I have to be." He sat back down in the heavy armchair. "If I'm not terrifying, people try to take what is mine, like they did 2 nights ago. I'm not yours." Dominic looked at her. His cold eyes tracked the pale skin of her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the sheer stubbornness radiating from her despite being wired to a heart monitor. "No," Dominic agreed softly. "You're not. You took a bullet meant for my family, Clara. You stood in front of my daughter without a weapon, without a plan, ready to fight men in Kevlar with your bare hands. I owe you a debt I can never repay." "I don't want your money," she muttered. "I know." Dominic leaned back, a bitter, exhausted smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You made that abundantly clear when you threw $10,000 back in my face. You are the most frustrating woman I have ever met." "It's a gift," Clara said, closing her eyes as a wave of exhaustion hit her. The pain meds were pulling her under again. "Just make sure the kid is okay. And Dominic?" "Yes." "Tell your surgeon he owes me a new uniform shirt. I like that one." She heard a low, genuine chuckle before she drifted back to sleep. Recovery was a miserable, humiliating process. Clara despised being an invalid. She hated the sterile medical bay. She hated the intravenous antibiotics. Mostly, she hated the quiet. By the 5th day, she demanded to be moved upstairs. The surgeon, a nervous man named Dr. Aris, who looked entirely out of place in a Mafia compound, looked at Dominic for permission. Dominic simply nodded. They put her in the massive guest room. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a bunker. Leo was stationed outside her door. The bodyguard with the scarred face had survived the assault, though his left arm was heavily bandaged. When Clara slowly walked past him, leaning heavily on a cane Mrs. Gable had procured, Leo didn't sneer. He stood rigidly at attention and gave her a sharp, respectful nod. She had earned her place in his brutal hierarchy the hard way. Life in the estate had fundamentally shifted. The tension that used to hum in the walls was gone, replaced by a heavy, settled quiet. Dominic had spent the days Clara was unconscious, tearing the city apart. She didn't ask for the details, but she saw the news on the flat-screen TV in her room. 3 warehouses burned to the ground. A prominent shipping executive found dead in his car. A massive restructuring of power in the Boston underground. Dominic had burned out the infection, root and stem. On the 8th day, Clara woke up feeling restless. The throbbing in her side had faded to a dull, persistent ache. She threw off the heavy duvet. She put on the grey sweatpants and a loose black t-shirt. She walked down the sweeping glass staircase, taking it one agonizing step at a time. The house was quiet. It was 6 in the morning. She pushed through the swinging doors into the massive kitchen. Dominic was sitting at the granite island. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in dark jeans and a plain grey shirt, an open laptop casting a pale blue light across his face. Beside him sat Lily. She was wearing pink pajamas, furiously working a charcoal pencil across the rough paper of her sketchbook. They both looked up when the door swung shut behind Clara. Dominic closed the laptop immediately. He stood up, a reprimand already forming on his lips. "You shouldn't be on your feet." Dr. Aris said, "If I have to eat one more bowl of Mrs. Gable's plain oatmeal, I am going to tear my own stitches out." Clara interrupted. She leaned the cane against the counter and limped toward the industrial refrigerator. Lily slid off her stool. She ran across the kitchen and wrapped her arms carefully around Clara's waist, making sure to avoid her right side. Clara rested a hand on the girl's tightly braided hair. "Hey, kid, you keeping him in line?" Lily nodded against Clara's stomach. Dominic watched them. The tight, defensive posture he always carried seemed to dissolve. He walked over, stepping into Clara's personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the smell of the dark roast coffee brewing in the corner. "Sit," Dominic said, his voice entirely lacking its usual authority. It sounded almost like a plea. "Tell me what you want, I'll make it." Clara looked at him, one eyebrow raised. "You? Cook? I saw you stare at a toaster last week like it was an explosive device." "I can follow instructions." Clara hesitated, then sighed. She was exhausted just from the walk downstairs. She let Lily lead her to a stool at the island. She sat down heavily, wincing. "All right, tough guy," Clara said, pointing a finger at the pantry. "Second shelf, heavy cast iron skillet. Don't drop it on your foot." For the next 20 minutes, Clara orchestrated a masterpiece of culinary instruction from her stool. Dominic, a man who commanded hundreds of armed men and moved millions of dollars with a phone call, followed her orders with absolute, rigid focus. He cracked eggs with too much force, dropping shells into the bowl. He nearly burned the bacon, but he didn't complain. Clara watched him flip the hash browns, the muscles in his back shifting under his shirt. It was an incredibly domestic scene, utterly at odds with the violent reality of his life. "Turn the heat down," Clara ordered. "You're searing it, not interrogating it." Dominic twisted the gas knob, glancing over his shoulder with a dry smirk. "You are an incredibly demanding woman." "And you are a terrible line cook," Clara shot back. "We all have our flaws." When he finally plated the food, sliding a portion in front of Clara and a smaller one for Lily, he stood on the opposite side of the island. He didn't eat. He just watched them. Clara took a bite. The eggs were slightly rubbery. The hash browns were under-seasoned. "Well?" Dominic asked. "It's edible," Clara said. "Don't quit your day job." Dominic let out a low breath, leaning against the counter. He looked out the window at the rising sun, the morning light catching the gold flecks in his eyes. "The diner was sold," Dominic said quietly. Clara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She stared at him. "What?" "The property management company folded. They liquidated their assets. The diner was bought by a developer yesterday. They're tearing it down next month to build a parking garage." Clara slowly lowered her fork. The diner, the grease, the chipped mugs, the worn linoleum. It was a miserable place, but it was hers. It was the only thing she had known for 5 years. "I see," Clara said. Her voice sounded hollow. "I tried to buy it," Dominic continued, his gaze returning to her face. "Through a shell company. I was outbid before I knew it was on the market. I'm sorry, Clara." Clara looked down at her plate. The world outside these reinforced walls was moving on without her. Her apartment lease was up in a week. Her job was gone. She had nothing to go back to. A small hand slid across the cool granite and rested on Clara's arm. Lily was looking at her, her dark eyes filled with an ancient, empathetic understanding. "It's okay," Clara said, forcing a tight smile for the kid. "It was a dump anyway. The roof leaked." Dominic didn't say anything. He just watched her, the heavy silence of the kitchen stretching between them, thick with unsaid words and an uncertain future. 4 weeks later, the physical scars were fading. The limp was gone, though the deep ache in Clara's ribs returned whenever it rained. And it rained often in Boston. She hadn't left the estate, not because Dominic forbade it, but because she simply had nowhere else to go. Her belongings from the basement apartment had been boxed up and brought to the guest room by Leo. She was entirely untethered from her past, but a new routine had taken root. It was a Tuesday morning. The kitchen was warm, filled with the rich, yeasty smell of batter. Clara stood at the stove, wearing a clean white apron Mrs. Gable had left for her. Dominic was sitting at his usual spot at the island. He was drinking the pitch-black coffee Clara had brewed, reviewing a stack of manila folders. The business of running an empire never stopped, but he no longer hid it in his study. He did it here, in the open, anchored by the noise of the kitchen. "You're paying too much for transit security," Clara said, flipping a large, perfectly golden pancake onto a platter. Dominic didn't look up from the folder, but a smirk pulled at his mouth. "Are you a logistics expert now? I know a grift when I see one. That firm you're using is overcharging you for hazard pay on routes that haven't seen action in a decade. You're bleeding cash on the south side." Dominic closed the folder. He looked at her, his expression entirely serious, though the coldness that used to define his features was entirely gone. "Remind me to put you on the payroll. You're more terrifying than my accountants." "I don't work for criminals," Clara said smoothly, pouring more batter onto the hot iron. "You live with one. The rent is free, and the coffee beans are decent. I tolerate it." Footsteps patted rapidly against the hardwood floor. Lily ran into the kitchen, her school uniform pristine, her hair braided. She carried a new sketchbook, the old one completely filled. She climbed onto the stool next to Dominic, Clara scooped up a specific pancake from a separate plate. She turned and slid it onto a plate in front of Dominic. It was completely blackened. A charcoal disc of ruined batter. Dominic stared at it. He looked up at Clara. "What is this?" "The first batch," Clara said, deadpan. "I burn the first batch. It's a rule. Eat up, boss." Lily clamped a hand over her mouth. Her small shoulders shook. A soft, melodic sound filled the kitchen. "It looks like a hockey puck," Lily said. Dominic froze. Clara stopped wiping the counter. The rag dropped from her hand, hitting the granite with a wet slap. It was the first complete sentence Lily had spoken in 3 years. Her voice was slightly raspy from disuse, tiny and fragile, but it was clear. It was real. Dominic slowly turned his head to look at his daughter. His hands were visibly shaking. He reached out, his large fingers gently cupping the side of Lily's face. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia king was entirely undone by 6 words. Lily leaned into his hand. She looked at the blackened pancake, then up at Clara. "Can I have a good one?" Lily asked. Clara swallowed the massive lump in her throat. She felt tears burning the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She grabbed the platter of golden pancakes and set them on the island. "Yeah, kid," Clara whispered, her voice rough. "You can have all the good ones." Dominic looked from his daughter to the woman standing behind the counter. The exhaustion, the violence, the endless war of his life. It all faded against the quiet, undeniable warmth of this kitchen. Clara had walked into his chaotic, blood-soaked world, refused his money, insulted his food, and somehow stitched his broken family back together. He didn't need to say it. Clara saw it in his eyes, the absolute, unyielding devotion. He wasn't just protecting what was his anymore. He was loving it. "Pass the syrup," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. He picked up his fork and drove it into the burnt pancake. Clara smiled, leaning against the counter as the morning light poured through the windows, chasing the last of the shadows away. The silence was finally broken, not by gunfire, but by the sweet, hesitant voice of a little girl who found her way back to the world. Clara never expected to trade a greasy diner apron for a place in a Mafia king's fortified estate, but sometimes the most beautiful families are built from the most broken pieces. What did you think of Clara and Dominic's explosive journey? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this with a friend who loves a gritty romance, and subscribe for more epic storytelling.